And I think that, as Mr. Franks mentioned some time ago, we are Sabbath keepers, but sometimes the Sabbath is not a subject that we cover as often as one might think we would. Being Sabbath keepers, I think we oftentimes assume everyone's heard a lot of subjects on it, and I think for the most part we have, but it is a topic that I think it's important to revisit on occasion because of the tendency that we have as human beings and what we see in the Bible, the tendency that Israel had in terms of either keeping it in a way that wasn't intended and having all kinds of rules and regulations that never was anticipated to be part of the Sabbath, or more often than not, more often in fact, is not keeping it in a way that honors the Sabbath as a day that is holy. And I think if you're anything like me over the course of years in the church, perhaps you've changed your perspective a little bit, not in terms of whether the Sabbath should be kept holy, but in terms of what you do and what you don't do. In preparation for this, I was reading some old articles back in the 50s and all about the Sabbath. And it was interesting, at one point they were listing some things that of course we wouldn't do on the Sabbath. And one of the things mentioned was taking a drive. And I thought, oh, how times have changed. We have to take a drive to services. And it's not always the most pleasant take a drive going on the interstates and all. In many ways, it seems like a nice little drive out a country road would be a very pleasant thing to do on the Sabbath compared to getting to church. So times change. But you know, in that sense, the Sabbath doesn't change. But sometimes we may alter our perspective a little bit. There was a time when taking a drive was very much a recreational thing to do. And perhaps some of us still do on occasion. There have been times I've taken a drive usually to relax out in the countryside or something. You get to a certain age and perhaps taking the drive is the only way you can experience nature because walking in it's not a very good idea sometimes. But I just bring up that example because sometimes there are little things that can change, but the Sabbath is still holy. And it's oftentimes good to think about what we're doing and how we're keeping it and ask the fundamental question, are we keeping the Sabbath in a way that pleases God? Are we keeping the Sabbath in a way that pleases God? When we look back at the Scripture, we see that there were two primary ways that the Sabbath was dishonored. Two primary ways it was dishonored. If you go back to Exodus chapter 16, we'll start there. Again, we desire to keep it holy, but oftentimes there are many questions that arise. You know, is it okay to do this? Is it okay to do that? Am I keeping it holy if I do such and such? And we have to make these judgments. And what I really want to focus on today is the principles that we use to make those judgments. Because the Bible has a number of places that indicate the principles that we can use. How we can misuse certain ideas and how we can use it well. Because all of us have to make those judgments. I am not going to give a big long list of what's okay and what's not. It's something that we have to use our judgment and figure out based on the principles we see in the Bible. What we see again, Israel had the problem from the very start of dishonoring the Sabbath, not keeping it holy. Exodus 16 is the story of manna. I talked about manna in a few sermons ago, and we read through this passage. But it talks about how God gave them manna every day of the week except for the Sabbath. And on the sixth day, verse 22, so it was on the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And then he said to them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So we see here in various places that in this case, God was reintroducing this concept that had been instituted at creation. But he's showing the Israelites, even before the giving of the 10 Commandments, that this is an expected law. It is one of the moral laws that God has set in motion. Now, in our world, we would never consider anything that has to do with a day and how we observe a day to be moral. But God defines morality, doesn't he? We in our own minds can reason all kinds of ways and describe our own morality. But God has set it, He says it is a day of rest, a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. It says, bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept till morning. So they laid it up till morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Now, of course, as you remember, any other day of the week it had worms and it stank. But God worked a special miracle on the Sabbath, so they didn't have to go gather. They could simply rest. They could observe the Sabbath in a way that was holy. And this is God explaining to them, this is how, in this environment, you keep God's Sabbath holy. Now, none of us had to gather twice the manna yesterday as we did today. We don't have manna anymore. But, of course, the principle remains to prepare for the Sabbath, so that we don't have to do a whole bunch of stuff that's unnecessary on the Sabbath. The principle is still there, and we can learn from it, even though it's a very different context. Verse 27, now it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? And so God was upset with the Israelites because they did what they normally would do. Went out to gather the manna. And I think that's something that we can learn from too, because it's very easy in our lives to just do what we would normally do. And that's one of the things that jumps out as very quickly in the story of the Sabbath, is just doing what we normally do, what we don't have to do. I mean, we have to eat and things like that, but they didn't have to gather manna. God had worked it out so that it would be okay. Some of them went to gather. It's what they wanted to do. Perhaps they wanted more manna. Perhaps they wanted to eat more. I don't know. But maybe it was just a routine. But what we know is they just didn't keep it. They didn't keep it holy. They didn't evidently have the consciousness of knowing this is God's Sabbath, I'm going to act differently today. And God demonstrates for us, though, that He was serious about this law. Numbers chapter 15, this is a place in Scripture where, listening to, reading an atheist writer recently, he brought up this example of who would want to worship such a cruel God, is the way he put it in his book. Numbers chapter 15, we have the story of a man who was found. This is while the children of Israel were in the wilderness. This man was found gathering sticks on the Sabbath. Obviously, he's gathering sticks to build a fire. And they find him, and he's gathering sticks, and they brought him. In verse 34, they put him under guard because it had not yet been explained what they should do to him. They didn't know what God's punishment would be. Would they just let him go, don't gather sticks anymore? Would God say, well, it's just gathering sticks. As long as they're not bigger than 6 inches, then maybe they're fine. What would God's judgment be? And verse 35, the Lord said to Moses, the man must surely be put to death. Whoa! Now, to those who don't like the idea of God, they look at this and say, put to death over gathering sticks? What kind of mean, evil, cruel God do you worship? Just gathering sticks. What a trivial thing. But notice it goes on to say, all the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. Everybody's got to be part of putting this man to death. What a cruel God. It goes on to say that they stoned him with stones and he died. What kind of God would do this for such a trivial thing? Well, I'd like to switch the question around and say, what kind of man would go do something that he knew the God of this universe had said, don't do? I want you to rest today. Go gather your sticks on Friday. I'm just telling you, what you need to do this on Friday. You can rest on Saturday, on Sabbath. And this man just goes out flaunting everything he'd been told, everything he knew was supposed to do, and he's going to gather sticks anyway. See what God has to say about it. Now, of course, we're not told the attitude, but it seems pretty clear, the attitude, for him to be doing something he knew not to do. We see in the Scriptures, other Scriptures, so many of them, where God is very merciful for those who don't understand. Evidently, this person did understand. He was going to do what he wanted anyway. And God, what kind of God would not treat this seriously if it's one of his laws? If he didn't treat it seriously, then everybody's going to get the impression that it's just Sabbath. It doesn't really matter. God's really not that serious about it. But in this case, this man evidently flaunting the Sabbath, doing what he wanted, not caring what God said. What kind of God wouldn't punish that? Because what kind of parent wouldn't punish a child for doing what was overtly in their face they just told them not to do? We've all been through it, haven't we? A young child testing their boundaries. Don't pick up that cookie. Pick up the cookie, and what do? We proceed to have to punish because they did it just to test if we were serious. What kind of God wouldn't punish such an act? Even though it seems to us, in one sense, it seems so trivial, it wasn't. It was God's Sabbath. They'd been told. He had been warned. And he was flouting God and not keeping the Sabbath in the way he'd clearly been told. So we see here that God takes the Sabbath seriously. God takes it seriously. In one sense, you would think it's the easiest commandment to keep. Don't work. Oh, wish my boss would tell me don't work. I like what my boss gives me a day off. I like what my company gives us extra days off. Here he gives us this day, and all we can do as humans oftentimes is be pushed to not rest, to not do what he's asked us to do. He gave it to us as a blessing. We'll talk more about that. But we tend to see it in a different way. And the reason why is because of Satan's influence and this nature that we have. It doesn't like to be told what to do. It wants to do our own thing. It goes on, if you read at the end of Ezekiel, I'll read Ezekiel 20, verse 12. We see here that ultimately God punished the nations of Israel and Judah, partly and largely because they didn't keep the Sabbath. They just couldn't rest. Simple thing to do. They just couldn't or wouldn't do it. Ezekiel 20, verse 12 says, "Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. Yet the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes. They despised my judgments, which if a man does, he will live by them. And they greatly defiled my Sabbaths. Then I said I would pour out my fury on them in the wilderness to consume them." And it goes on to talk about verse 16, because they despised my judgments, did not walk in my statutes, profaned my Sabbaths, and went after their idols. And we have other places we could turn to that talks about this concept. In fact, I'll just flip over real quickly to chapter 22 of Ezekiel. Chapter 22 and verse 26, where it says, "My priests have violated my law, profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and the unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the unclean and the clean. And they have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths, so that I am profaned among them." So when we profane the Sabbath, we are profaning God. There's a connection there, because God has established this day. And there is an admonition here for us as ministers, I take it this way, to make sure that occasionally we are reviewing the idea of what's holy and what isn't holy, what's profane. How do we judge between what is right and wrong? How do we keep things holy? Do we teach others that that's important? Do we as parents teach our children the difference between the holy and the profane? How do we do it? How do we teach our children these things? How do we teach our children in a way that they want to keep the Sabbath, rather than in a way that they look forward to the day when they are out of the house and they can just do what they want. And keeping the Sabbath is not part of it. How do we teach it in that way? I think that one of the important things that we need to do as parents, and that we need to do as we think about the Sabbath, is to think about the purpose God made it. Because it's so easy to think about all the things we can or can't do, let's say, all the rules and regulations that we might establish. We tell our children they can't do this, you can't do that, it's a Sabbath. But I really want to know it's a Sabbath. But are we teaching them the reason for the Sabbath? Are we teaching them the reason? Because understanding the reason for it is so important, rather than just what you can't do. Why is it? Why is it that we can't do that? Notice what we just read in Ezekiel 20. One of the very reasons and purposes here, one of the things that's just amazing about the Sabbath, Ezekiel 20, and verse 12, moreover, I give them my Sabbaths to be a sign. So the Sabbath is a sign, a reminder that between us and God, that we might know that God is the God who sanctifies us. God has set us apart to be His people, be given His Spirit to dwell in us individually and as a body. We've been set apart by God, and what an amazing thing that is. The Sabbath reminds us that God sanctifies us. That's an amazing thing. Just the fact that God has chosen us, called us, dwells in us, sees us differently, has forgiven us, is going to give us eternal life, going to give us the destiny of helping Him rule in the millennium. It's an amazing thing. This day, it's a sign of that and what God has done for us. There's no greater thing that we could ever celebrate than what this day means. But in our minds, if it's just a bunch of do's, or I should say don'ts, what I can't do, then we're pointing to the negative. And we're going to talk in a little bit about how that oftentimes backfires. The Sabbath is a sign that God sanctifies us. Now, when we teach our children, we probably can't use the word sanctify if they're very young, because we have to translate that into something they can understand, tell stories and all to help them see it. But plant in their mind from an early age that the Sabbath it teaches us something very positive. It's set aside, it's set apart as we have been set apart. And it reminds us of that. So again, we see that God takes the Sabbath seriously, so much so that a man was punished for flagrantly going against God. And the whole nation of Israel and nation of Judah was punished and went into captivity, largely because of their breaking the Sabbath. God takes the Sabbath seriously. But again, we can look at it simply as something God doesn't take. It's just our time. But God shows us that's not the case. I want to tell you a story as we get into the next point here. Because when we think about the Sabbath in terms of what the Pharisees and Sadducees did in the New Testament, they wanted to keep the Sabbath, but they missed the point of it. They missed the theological meaning of it. They missed the reason for the Sabbath. It became a day that you just don't do stuff. You can't do this. You can't do that. You can't walk more than a certain number of steps. You can't spit on the ground because it moves the earth, and that's plowing. You can't do all these things. That they had a huge list of things. It became, we kind of giggle at it because it doesn't make sense. But they had reasons. They had reasons for it. They wanted to make sure they didn't break the Sabbath, that God could look favorably upon them. I want to tell you a story of, it's a true story of what happened back in the early 80s. How many of you remember New Coke? It was an improvement from the classic Coke that had been sold, 100 years. They changed the formula. Time magazine called it the greatest marketing misstep of the decade, because they had the backlash. You changed the formula. There was one man named Gay Mullins from Seattle. He was in 1985. He was 57 years old. He was from Seattle. He invested $30,000 of his own money to go after Coke. Change it back. We want what we've always had. We want what we always have. We can't get it. We want it back. He created a 900 number hotline. Everybody was calling in, supporting. Give us the old Coke, or at least release the formula so somebody else can make it. They were dead serious. Big uproar. Eventually, Coke gave in and came back with classic Coke that we can, I believe, still enjoy today, if you so want to. The first case of classic Coke was sent by Coca-Cola to Gay Mullins in his successful attempt to keep the old. It's a classic illustration of we want what we can't get anymore. It's interesting that Mr. Mullins, he had a blind taste test. 2 blind taste tests, the old Coke or the new Coke. In both cases, he preferred the new. When he didn't know what he was tasting, he preferred the new. But that wasn't the point. He couldn't get the old anymore, and I want what I had before. And it's amazing how that power is in us as humans. Coke was no dummy of a company. They invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into marketing, not only marketing, but testing the new formula. And every time they did it, for 4 or 5 years, they tested over 200,000 people. The new Coke was preferred. In fact, as further evidence that the new Coke would be successful, some of the tests, they actually told the people, this is what you're used to, the old Coke, this is the new Coke. Which do you like? By far, or by more than even, more people chose it. When they knew it was the new Coke, they chose it to be their favorite. They thought this is going to be a hit. It bombed. Now, since then, analysts have looked at what happened, and they've realized that people want what they can't have. When they did the taste tests with new Coke, they couldn't get new Coke. You could only buy the old. They preferred what they couldn't have. Mr. Mullins, he couldn't get old Coke anymore. He preferred what he couldn't have. Even though he really liked the new better, he preferred what he couldn't have. It's something about our human nature that we want what we can't have. Now, that's an interesting thing to consider when we think about God's way of life, because we all have to deal with temptation. It could be any of God's laws. There's a natural tendency when God says don't, we say, why? Why not? It almost makes it more attractive because God said don't. We all know the classic thing of, if you see the wet paint on the chair, what do? Touch it because you got to see if it's still wet. There's something about our psyche that even with little children, if you say don't, they want it. My point is if the only way we're looking at the Sabbath is don'ts, we're going to be tempted to want what we can't have. If the only way we're teaching our children is you can't do, they're going to be tempted to want to do what we're saying don't do. And I think the story, I just use it to illustrate the fact that there is something fantastic that's available to us. If we're just framing it in terms of don't, we're going to unwittingly cause someone to want something. It happens. It's a psychological fact that's been repeated over and over in psychological tests. We want something when we're told we can't have it. We'll pursue it all the more. And so it's very important to consider that when we think about the Sabbath and how we keep it. The Pharisees and those in Christ's day were teaching the Sabbath in a way that really kind of caused people to want to break it. But there was such a penalty. They could put people to death for breaking one of their laws or some of their laws. If you go back to Mark chapter 2, verse 23. Mark chapter 2 and verse 23. We see here one of the stories we're familiar with in terms of Pharisees. and their strictness, or the Jewish leaders and their strictness. Mark 2, verse 23, now it happened that they went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, Christ and his disciples, that as they went, his disciples plucked heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, verse 27, Jesus went on to answer, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. They had a rule that you couldn't, how many of us really pick grain going through a grain field? We don't, but we might go out and we might have a strawberry growing or a raspberry growing on the Sabbath and pick it off the bush and eat it. To the Pharisees, that's breaking the Sabbath. You're harvesting. Even if you pick one, you're harvesting. You can't harvest on the Sabbath. Now, of course, they did it because they wanted to protect the Sabbath. But you see how it became such a strict thing that people had to worry whether they were taking too many steps. Because if I do, I could be penalized by the governing authorities. Imagine the U.S. government having a rule you can only walk so far on Sabbath. Or you can't pick an apple on the Sabbath. Otherwise, you could be penalized by the government. That's in essence where they lived, what they lived under. And it was a burden to them to keep up with everything they couldn't do. It was all what we couldn't do. Sabbath was made for man, Christ says. It's a gift. But they were turning it into something that wasn't a gift. It was a burden. Christ also said, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. He had the authority to explain how to keep the Sabbath. Now, he didn't go through a bunch of do's and don'ts. Had he done that, he didn't go through a bunch of don'ts, I should say, because had he done that in that very different society in that day, well, we don't do things the same way they did. He might have missed the fact that you shouldn't drive more than a certain distance on the Sabbath. Well, they wouldn't have known what driving is. He couldn't give that list because we live in a different age, but he could give principles. And he says he's the Lord of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was made for man. It is a gift. It is intended to be a gift. Some have asked, well, if it's a gift, why do you tell us how to use the gift? Well, God gave us life, but he also gave us parameters of how to live that life. If a parent, if your child turns a certain age and you want to give them a car, you probably set parameters. I'm giving you this for this reason, I expect you to use it in this way. And that's what God did. So God can give a gift and then have parameters associated with it. But the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders, they got so wrapped up in the what you can't do. They set a hedge, as it's been called, about the law so that no one would break it. And in doing so, they lost the purpose and meaning. Let's go to Mark chapter 3, continuing on in Mark. Another example here of just missing the meaning and how to judge whether something's appropriate or not. It says in verse 1 of Mark 3, and he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand. And so they watched him closely whether he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. Set him up here. Let's watch him, see if he's going to sin. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, step forward. And then he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they kept silent because according to the Pharisaical law, they were allowed to do things that would help a life. So they couldn't answer because had they answered truthfully, they would have said it would have been lawful. But they couldn't answer because they wanted to trap him. And it's that hypocrisy that caused Christ to get angry with them and their hardness of heart. They just couldn't have compassion on someone. It says they kept silent, verse 5, and when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by their hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out. His hand was restored, as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out immediately, plotted with the Herodians against him, they might destroy him. They hated the Herodians, but hey, they both hated Christ so much that let's plot together to have him killed. Let's get rid of him. They couldn't just get rid of him then and there. He had such a following. People were amazed by his miracles. So they had to be crafty in what they would do to set Christ up. But in this case, we see that Christ is teaching that the idea of restoring a hand to health is perfectly acceptable on the Sabbath. It's restoration. God rested and was restored on the Sabbath. We rest and are restored on the Sabbath physically. And he was going an extra measure further to restore someone's withered hand. It was perfectly fine. And if any of you have the power of the gift of healing, you can heal on the Sabbath. We know this from Scripture. And come talk to me if you do, because I got some healing I need done. It's okay to do on the Sabbath. It was about rest, restoration, healing, spiritually and physically. Now, because we don't typically see the gift of healing in the same way Christ had it, certainly, we obviously focus on the spiritual healing and restoration that we get on this day. It is even more of a miracle to be spiritually healed and restored. Sometimes I think it's easy to discount that and think of a withered hand being healed as being amazing, but the healing and restoration that God can do spiritually with us any day, and especially the Sabbath, that is a tremendous miracle. Something that God initiates, and something that we ought to consider as very important, very valuable to us. So in this case, they had all kinds of rules and regulations they couldn't do. I was speaking to someone, I won't mention the name, but you'll know who you are. I was speaking to someone recently. There was a convention of, I guess it was one of the sect of the Jews from up in New York that came down to Conroe, and they went to one of the resorts, and the staff was instructed they would have to turn on their lights on the Sabbath. They wouldn't turn their lights on or off because of kindling a fire. Can't kindle a fire. And for some reason, I don't know the reason, but they wouldn't even flush their toilets. The staff had to come in and flush the toilets because it was against their rules on Sabbath keeping. And again, people can get so wrapped up into that kind of legalism that even practical things, and people look at it and think, I don't want to be burdened with that kind of life. And that's not what the Sabbath is. We shouldn't teach it or present it as if it's a burden with that kind of extra rules and regulations. So we tend to recognize the lesson that Christ taught, not to be pharisaical in our Sabbath keeping with unnecessary rules and regulations. And as I present to you today, to not present the Sabbath or think of the Sabbath only in terms of don'ts, what we can't do. Now, what are some examples of things that we face today with regard to keeping the Sabbath? We don't face what Christ did, having to worry about healing someone, or walking through and plucking an apple and worry about breaking the Sabbath or somebody thinking we do. We are faced with practical problems of today. Do we work on the Sabbath? Well, the Bible clearly says we don't work, so we don't work. What do we do when there's an emergency? Well, we know there's the ox in the ditch principle, and we have to judge whether we're going to respond to the emergency, even if it's work or not. What do we do if the neighbor's house is burning down? Do we help them? There have been those over the years that have said no because it's work. There have been others who took great offense at that. We should help. We're saving a life. And I think that's what most of us would do. It's an emergency. We don't sit back and claim, well, I can't help my neighbor out of a burning house because it's work. It's those kind of extremes that people have used to undermine the Sabbath. But we realize from the principle that what Christ taught that kind of thing would be certainly appropriate. To stop and help someone who's had an accident, that's helping a fellow human life. So those kind of things we learn is important. Now, if we work as a doctor, should we go to work every Sabbath? Well, that's what we do every day. Even though we're helping, is it something we should do because it's a good thing? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that as we see a principle here in a little bit. But our young people face playing sports on the Sabbath, Friday nights, perhaps joining with school fundraisers or outings. How do we judge these things? How do we discern what we should or shouldn't do? Perhaps we decide that, I'm not going to play basketball, but golf is much more restful. And the principle of rest. We can apply a principle that's in the Bible, but maybe misapply it. How do we know if we're misapplying a principle? Bible says rest. I'm not going to play basketball. I'm just going to play golf. Is that really that much better? Practical things our young people face too. The SAT is often given on the Sabbath. What do we do? Sometimes we can say, well, it's a one-time thing. I'll never, hopefully, have to take the SAT ever again. So that's okay. But we've got a form in the church that the pastors send out asking them to change the day, and they typically will. You just have to jump through the hoops. And it can be frustrating sometimes to have to do that, but they typically will do that kind of thing. But again, how do we discern these things? I think it's important to, again, consider the story of the Sabbath. Consider the origins of it and what God reveals to us about it. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2, and beginning in verse 1, the origin of the Sabbath. As part of the beginning of the story of the Sabbath. I think when we tell the story of the Sabbath to our young children, it helps them appreciate the value of it, the things that are so good about it. Verse 1 of Genesis chapter 2 says, "And the heavens and the earth and all the host in them were finished. On the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work which he had done." Notice, first of all, that God didn't tell us to do anything he wasn't doing himself. He celebrated the Sabbath by resting. He set an example for us. And in verse 3, he says, "And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all the work which he had created and made." So God rested, and by resting, he sanctified it and he blessed it. And so, again, God set the day apart. He blessed this day. He set it apart for a special, holy purpose, in which we keep. Now, notice also that God had said numerous times that the creation was very good. What he had done was he was doing something that was very good. It was providing life for all the animals, for the fish, for the birds, for us. He was doing a good thing. So why didn't he just keep doing a good thing on the Sabbath day? After all, if it's a good thing, it should be okay, right? Well, we have to be careful how we apply that principle, because God himself was doing amazingly good things. What could be more amazingly good than creating life? But yet, he stopped. And so there is a time where even when something is good, it's appropriate to stop. And we don't just apply the principle, if it's good, it's okay, because God himself didn't apply the principle that way. He blessed this day. He created it to be something good. He rested, and he set the day aside. Now let's go back to Exodus chapter 20. Again, familiar scripture to us, the Sabbath command. Exodus 20, and picking up in verse 8. Verse 8, it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." Again, we've oftentimes stressed the idea of remembering because it's easy for us as humans to forget, to kind of let it go by the wayside. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. I think one of the ways that helps us remember is the fact that we come together. We know we're coming to church. It's not like any of the other days. If you were sitting at home retired and you didn't have a lot of hobbies, and you didn't have a lot to do, and you didn't come to church, it would almost seem like any other day of the week. The Sabbath, we always know it's coming. We're going to do something special, go be with our brethren. It says, remember it. Coming together helps us remember. It says, keep it holy. How do we keep it holy? Well, he goes on to say, you shall do no work in it, nor your son, nor your daughter, your male servant, female servant, everyone that's under your control, your authority, you're supposed to allow them to rest. Goes on to say in verse 11, 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in it, all that's in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So it's a blessed day. Hopefully we don't look at it as a burden in some way. I have had people very close to me say that they gave up the Sabbath. They said they've always seen it as a burden. They always wondered if they were breaking it, always feeling guilty about something. It was such a burden. Well, that wasn't the intention of the day from the beginning. It never should have felt that way. It was to be a rest, a release from those types of feelings. Notice in Leviticus 23, where God lists His festivals. We oftentimes call them His holy days, but not all of them are holy in the same sense as a Sabbath is. The Passover is kept, but it's not listed as a holy, but it's a feast. It's one of God's festivals. The first one mentioned is the Sabbath. It's a feast. What do you do on a feast? Typically, you enjoy it. Now, on atonement, that's a feast, yes, and we don't enjoy food, but we enjoy spiritual meat on atonement. We find other ways to enjoy the meaning of atonement, but typically a feast is something we very much enjoy. So we ought to enjoy. This is a feast. Today is a feast that we ought to be enjoying. It says, verse 3, that 6 days your work shall be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. So we recognize that there is a calling together, a holy calling together that's very different than just any community calling. It's one that is set apart. This meeting is set apart by God to be holy. It's not just a Sabbath, it's holy. It's this convocation that is holy to us, holy to God. And we keep it that way. Hebrews chapter 10. You don't have to turn there. We're very familiar. But it says, do not forsake the assembling of ourselves together. We need to be together as God's people. Now that is a principle that we see. Holy convocation is something we do on a holy day, and not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some. Now there are some who can't be with us, and they would love to be with us, but because of health reasons and all, they can't. And so they do the next best thing, watch the webcast, and we understand that. But we ought to enjoy being together and be together. That's one of the major things that we do on the Sabbath, is come together with God's people. I remember a story of a young person who told me once that they were having to analyze whether they did something. It was a school project. It was a service project. It was something that, it wasn't like building a house. It was something that it wasn't work in that regard, but it was for a very good purpose. It was helping someone. And so they deemed it would be okay to do that on the Sabbath. It's not a regular thing. It's something we'll just do because it's helping. It's good. And but came to me later, and they said that they said, you know, as I was with all my school friends and all, it was the same type of conversations we've had any day of the week. I had to hear the same kind of jokes, the same kind of worldly stuff. And she said it just didn't feel like the Sabbath. Even though I thought it was okay doing what we were doing, it didn't have the sense of Sabbath keeping. I won't do that again. Even though I thought it would be okay, it just didn't feel like a Sabbath thing. And I thought that was very perceptive, because it wasn't just analyzing whether the thing itself, but is the environment something that contributes to what the Sabbath ought to be? In this case, it wasn't that the friends were evil or bad. It just didn't have a Sabbath sense to it. And in her eyes, it was important for it to feel like the Sabbath and not just any other day of the week around the same people and all. Again, I'm not saying we can't be around somebody who's not a church member by any means. But there is that sense that we can have of, is this really a Sabbath thing, experience that I need to be having? Again, we're told to have a holy convocation, to come together with God's people. And that should be a major focus. It's a principle that should be a major focus for us as we decide what's appropriate and what's not on the Sabbath. Are we around God's people? How do people typically decide these things, whether it's appropriate or not to do something on the Sabbath? It's kind of funny. I think probably we've all decided in different ways over the years. Perhaps when you first came into the church, you'd look around, what is everybody else doing? You know, it's pretty typical to kind of gain what you learn from everybody else. That's one of the ways that people decide what's appropriate, is what's other people doing. Now, the downside, the good part of that is if they're really keeping the Sabbath well, we're following a good example. But If they're not taking the Sabbath very seriously, we might think, well, that's okay because such and such, so-and-so is doing it. And so it really is something we ought to analyze the principles ourselves and know what we're doing and why, rather than just following other principles. Sometimes people will say, well, one activity is better than something else. Golf is better than basketball, therefore golf must be okay. And we compare activities. And if one seems to be more restful, then, well, maybe that's okay. Again, that's not always the best way of doing it either. I like to do it. I think it should be fine. It can be dangerous too, because just because we think it should be fine doesn't necessarily mean God thinks it should be fine. We can think, oh, God will understand because I'm doing it with a good heart. Well, God appreciates a good heart, but are we doing what God wants us to do? Or are we doing something He would say we ought not to do? What about, I don't want to be pharisaical about the Sabbath. We all have heard that many times. If I don't do this, maybe I think I shouldn't, but I don't want to be pharisaical about it, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Well, that's not very effective either, just to avoid something because we don't want to keep a rule. Maybe it's a rule we should keep. We shouldn't base it on just, I don't want to seem pharisaical. We should base it on the principles, not avoiding being like someone else. What about, well, I want to be balanced about the Sabbath. Balance can be good. When you're on a balance beam and you don't want to fall off of it, staying right in the middle can be good. If you've got a choice between poison and medicine, to take a little of each, to be balanced, isn't always a good thing. Balance can be good, balance may not be good. Sometimes we can want to be balanced, have a balanced approach, but allow ourselves to do things that we really shouldn't be doing because we're mixing a little good with a little evil and think that we're being balanced. Let's go to Philippians chapter 1, if you will. Philippians chapter 1, verse 9 and 10. I think this is a principle we should all seek. It's not just what's somebody else doing. What is it I want to do? I don't want to be pharisaical. I want to be balanced. Those can be good principles, but they shouldn't define how we judge the Sabbath. Ultimately, we're seeking one thing. We're seeking to apply God's godly principles in this way. Not in a balanced way, but in this way. Philippians 1, verse 9. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and all discernment. That's what we're looking to do with regard to the Sabbath. We show God love by keeping His Sabbath as in the way that He's pleased. And that love should abound. Our knowledge about why we're doing what we're doing should abound more and more as we continue in our spiritual lives. Verse 10 says, that you may approve the things that are excellent. That's what we're seeking. We're not seeking balance. Now, again, sometimes balance is a good thing, but we're seeking excellence, that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ. He prays, he says this is one of his prayers, that you may approve the things that are excellent. The New International says the things that are best. It's easy in our lives to approve the things that are adequate. That we think, well, God probably is okay with this. It should be okay. But is it excellent? I'm not going to stand here and define for you every aspect of excellence. That's something we come to decide ourselves. But as we evaluate our Sabbath keeping, are we doing what's excellent? It's very easy for any of us to start doing things that maybe we wouldn't have done a couple of years ago, but we kind of enjoy. And when we really think about it, maybe we would say, well, it's not really the best thing to do on the Sabbath. And it's something we might, well, I'm just going to do differently. I'm going to take that out of my Sabbath routine because I think I'd rather not do it. That's a judgment that we make between us and God. But what we're seeking and what Paul prayed for, and hopefully we can all pray for one another, that we pursue those things that are excellent, that we may truly grow in love and knowledge and discernment. That's what we're asking God to do, and it's a good prayer to ask. It's a good thing to ask God for spiritual discernment, to help us to see our nature, the way we tend to be. We're not evil, but at the same time, we have desires, we have pulls, we have temptations. Ask God to give us the discernment that we need to making decisions that are important in God's eyes, whether it's the Sabbath or any other of God's commands. You know, it's interesting when I think back at the creation of the Sabbath. And God created man, woman. He created mankind on the sixth day. And then God rested. And it's interesting to me that the first full day that humans would have experienced was a day where they didn't have to do anything except talk to God, where God could just communicate with Adam and Eve on the Sabbath in the garden. How many Sabbaths did that happen before the tree incident? I don't know. But you think, what an amazing thing. God, we know, because after they sinned, God was walking through the cool of the day to come visit with them, and they were hiding. Evidently, this was a common thing. And I can certainly see Adam doing his work during the garden, whatever he did, and Eve doing what she did, and God coming visiting with them, especially on the Sabbath. The first full day would have been a Sabbath. And it's interesting that God had finished his physical creation. It was done. No more different kinds of animals. There was done. Everything physically was set in motion. The only thing that was left was helping man become what he was created to be, a child of God. The only thing left was that spiritual creation. On the Sabbath, God could begin talking to them, instructing them, and helping them to become spiritually the kind of person that he wanted them to be. There was still a kind of creation going on, but it was spiritual. He was molding and shaping them. When I look at that and think about that, that to me stands out as a major Sabbath principle. How are we being molded and shaped by God? Because we are physically created. We are who we are. We like it or not, we're here. How are we developing spiritually? That is a wonderful Sabbath question, because we can develop spiritually, take extra time in Bible study and prayer and fellowship, meditation, in ways that we can't do the other days of the week, especially if we have busy lives, if we have work and taking care of kids and everything that goes on. We can focus on the things that are Sabbath-oriented, things that God would have focused on if we were in the garden with him, if you were Adam and Eve, and you could spend that day walking and talking with God, where he could be developing you spiritually into what you needed to be. Again, physical creation was done. Spiritual was beginning. And I think that's an important thing to consider. Let's go to Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58. Another thing here that shows us we ought to see the Sabbath in a very positive light. Not the way that the Jewish leaders in the New Testament times, in their quest to make sure they didn't break the Sabbath, they caused it to be a burden. They didn't see the Sabbath and the joy that it ought to be. Isaiah 58, verse 13, it says, if you turn your foot away from the Sabbath. Now, to turn your foot to someone in that culture was an insult. In our culture, we'll prop up our feet and show our soles to another person. We don't think a thing about it. But some cultures, if you show the bottom of your foot to them, that's an insult. You're insulting them. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about. If you turn your foot away from the Sabbath, if we don't consider it a negative thing, we don't mistreat it. It says, from doing your own pleasure on my holy day. Now, what does that mean? I like to eat lunch. Does it mean I can't eat lunch or breakfast or dinner on the Sabbath? There are pleasures we enjoy on the Sabbath, but I think we understand what it's saying, doing the things that we maybe would do during the week that we would find our pleasure in sports or gaming, whatever it is that we do during the week, finding our own pleasure rather than focusing on that relationship that we can have with our Creator and one another. Those things should be pleasurable. Nothing unpleasurable about fellowship. But we can take pleasure in it, but is it our own? Is it simply for our own good, or is it something we're growing spiritually? It says, from doing your own pleasure on my holy day. and call the Sabbath a delight. Do we teach our children that the Sabbath is delightful? Do we enjoy the Sabbath with them? I've had individuals that I know, they thought they were doing a wonderful job. They would force all their children to have 2 hours of Bible study on the Sabbath and lecturing them for 2 hours at the table. Nothing wrong with family Bible study, but when we're talking about lecturing kids that want to be doing something else and forcing them to be there, it kind of puts a damper on their experience of the Sabbath. The intentions were good, but are we doing delightful things, enjoying it as a family, and talking about God and His way as we walk by the way? Are we teaching them that it's a delight? Do we feel it's a delight? It says, a holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor Him, not doing your own ways or finding your own pleasure, nor seeking your own words. Then you shall delight yourself in the Lord. Notice that. When we delight ourselves in the Sabbath, we're delighting ourselves in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. There is a promise that when we call the Sabbath a delight, when we keep it in a way that's pleasing with God, that He will bless us. There's a promise there. It says, the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. Well, it's a wonderful promise that we have. We have, and I'm not going to go through, there's so many other scriptures we could talk about, but think of Colossians 2, verse 7. When we think about the meaning of the Sabbath, it talks about the Sabbath, which is a shadow of things to come, in Colossians 2, verse 17. The Sabbath pictures the millennium. Largely the millennium. A wonderful time in the earth when all of humanity can learn to live happy, joyful lives. Sabbath points to that. In Hebrews chapter 4, again, we could go there, and it talks about the rest that we look forward to. The rest of the kingdom. The rest that we have in the kingdom. We rest because we're celebrating not only the relationship we have with God, but also what God is giving us in the future. Wonderful millennial time. His kingdom. Do we focus on that? That's certainly something that's very appropriate as we think about, as we teach our children, grandchildren, about why the Sabbath is so awesome. Not why it's a burden, but why it's so awesome. The things we can enjoy and how important they are, and learning to do those things in a way that is enjoyable. It's delightful. It's something I think that we can all think about. Again, these are all biblical principles that can help guide us to not set rules based on other people, to not do things just because of other people or just because we don't want to be a certain way, but to look to the principles of the Bible. God tells us some things we are not to do, but He gives us a lot of things we can think about and do on the Sabbath, and we can learn to enjoy those things. The more we focus on becoming like God, the more we will delight in spiritual things. So I hope these principles can be helpful. And again, as I said, Philippians 1, verse 9, where it says to seek that which is excellent. What are we doing on the Sabbath that is excellent? And what are we doing that maybe isn't so excellent we might change? It's a question we should ask ourselves periodically, because God does command us to remember the Sabbath day. He has given it to us as a gift, as a blessing. We have the opportunity to desire to be part of God's family, and for God to be the desire for Him to be part of our lives. I hope that we can all learn to truly keep and enjoy the Sabbath in a way that's pleasing to God.